Before humanity was created, there was a rebellion in the heavens. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe a group called the Igigi, lesser gods forced to labor for the powerful Anunnaki. But according to the myth, the Igigi grew tired of their servitude and revolted. Some researchers believe this wasn't just mythology, but a coded account of ancient astronauts and a cosmic uprising that changed human history forever. Did the Igigi rebellion lead to the creation of mankind? Was this the first recorded war among the gods? In this video, we uncover what the ancient tablets actually say, and how modern theories reinterpret this forgotten uprising. The ancient Anunnaki are said to have created the human race by genetically modifying early humans in order to use them as a labor force. But before humans were created, the Igigi were used by the ancient Anunnaki as their main labor force. It is said that the Igigi, they who turn and see, were the ancient astronaut gods of the younger generation, the servants to the mighty Anunnaki. They were half human, half animals, who came to Earth to mine gold. The terminology used to describe the gods is extremely complicated and still needs many studies. Researchers believe the term Igigi is of Semitic origin and indicates the group of gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. It is still unclear which ancient gods belong to the Igigi, but many scholars suggest Marduk, the patron god of the city of Babylon, was one of the Igigi. Mainstream scholars use the term Igigi to reference the mythological Sumerian deities. According to mainstream scholars, the Igigi were the younger servants of the Anunnaki who initiated a rebellion against their masters and dictatorship of Enlil. Eventually, the Anunnaki replaced the Igigi with humans. In the myth of Atrahasis, the Babylonian story of the flood, and a precursor to the flood story in the Gilgamesh ep, the Sumerian paradise is described as a garden where lower gods, the Igigi, were put to work digging a watercourse by their masters, the Anunnaki. When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. The 7 great Anunnaki were making the Igigi suffer the work. When the gods, man-like, bore the labor, carried the load, the gods' load was great, the toil grievous, the trouble excessive. The great Anunnaki, the 7, were making the Igigi undertake the toil. Ancient astronaut hypothesis suggests that the Igigi were similar to the Anunnaki, remaining in constant orbit around our planet. They were basically considered as intermediaries between our planet and Nibiru, home of the Anunnaki. Many believe that the Igigi remained in constant orbit around our planet, in giant platforms, which processed or delivered from Earth. After processing the minerals, the material was transferred to other ships and eventually transported to the home planet of the Anunnaki. The Igigi were apparently never encountered by mankind. It is said that several texts make reference to them, suggesting the Igigi were too high up for mankind and consequently were not concerned with people. After years of tenuous and hard work for the Anunnaki, the Igigi rebelled against their masters. It is said that they set fire to their tools and surrounded Enlil's great house by night, forcing the ancient Anunnaki to find another source of labor. This is why the ancient Anunnaki replaced the Igigi after genetically engineering ancient humans, creating a greater workforce. Many authors suggest that the human slave race was created after the ancient Anunnaki genetically modified their genes and that of early humans nearly 500,000 years ago, before the beginning, the cosmos of the ancient Sumerians. In the beginning, according to the ancient Sumerians, there was nothing but a vast and formless void, an endless sea of darkness that the ancients called the Abzu, the primordial waters from which all creation would eventually emerge. The universe, in this earliest cosmological conception, was not born from nothing, but rather from a transformation of what already existed in a primal, undifferentiated state. It was from this infinite abyss, this cosmic ocean of possibility, that the first gods emerged, pulling themselves into existence with purpose and intent that far surpassed anything the human mind could at that time, or perhaps even now, fully comprehend. The Sumerians, widely regarded as the world's first truly advanced civilization, left behind an astonishing record of their beliefs about the nature of the cosmos, the origins of their gods, and the story of how humanity itself came to exist. written on clay tablets in the earliest known form of writing, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay called cuneiform. These records represent some of the oldest literature in human history. They were preserved in the dry desert sands of ancient Mesopotamia, what is today the nation of Iraq, waiting thousands of years to be discovered, translated, and ultimately reinterpreted by scholars and researchers who would find within them details that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of mythology, religion, and even human prehistory. What the Sumerians described in their earliest texts was not simply a mythology in the way that modern people typically understand mythology, that is, as a set of symbolic stories serving psychological or social functions. Stories that everyone understands are not literally true. The Sumerians appear to have regarded their accounts of the gods as historical records. They described their deities not as symbols or metaphors, but as actual beings who had walked among them, who had spoken to them, who had given them laws and knowledge and civilization itself. They described the activities of their gods in terms that are startlingly specific, including details about governance and administration, labor and engineering, conflict and politics that seem far too elaborate and pragmatic to serve purely symbolic functions. The cosmological worldview of the Sumerians divided existence into several distinct realms. There was the An, the heavens above, the domain of the sky. There was the Ki, the earth below, the domain of physical matter and life. And there was the Abzu, the primordial underground waters, the source of fresh water and also of wisdom and mystery. These three realms were not merely geographical or physical designations. They were also hierarchical domains occupied by beings of different natures and different levels of cosmic authority. The gods who ruled the heavens were supreme. The gods who ruled the earth were powerful but secondary, and the beings who lived in or near the Abzu partook of a kind of mysterious, ancient wisdom that even the gods in the heavens respected and sometimes feared. Into this cosmic framework, the Sumerians placed a hierarchy of divine beings that is, when examined closely, one of the most complex and internally consistent divine hierarchies in the ancient world. At the top of this hierarchy sat the supreme gods, beings of such power and authority that even the stars and the movements of the celestial spheres were said to be subject to their will. Below them were ranked gods of lesser but still enormous power, organized into councils and assemblies that made collective decisions about the fate of the world and of humanity. Still further below were the divine servants, the workers of heaven, the beings who carried out the great cosmic projects decreed by the gods above them. And at the very bottom of this divine hierarchy, separated from the gods by an enormous gap of capability and consciousness, sat humanity, the most recent creation made to serve those above. This hierarchy, with its remarkable specificity about rank, role, function, and interrelationship, is what makes Sumerian mythology so striking to modern investigators who approach it from the perspective of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. For the hierarchy they describe is not the kind of vague spiritual structure typical of most world mythologies. It is rather a remarkably concrete organizational structure that resembles nothing so much as a corporate or military chain of command, a structure in which orders flow from above and labor is performed below, in which rebellion is possible and must be managed, in which resource extraction is a primary concern, and in which the creation of a more efficient workforce can solve the problem of labor shortage. The parallels to human organizational structures are, many argue, simply too specific and too numerous to be explained away as mere coincidence or as the inevitable projection of human social structures onto divine beings. To understand the Igigi and their place in this cosmic drama, it is necessary first to understand the world in which they existed, a world governed by the Anunnaki, shaped by purposes that stretched across the vast distances of interstellar space, and driven by a need for resource extraction that reached across the stars themselves. To understand the Anunnaki is to understand the context in which everything else in this story takes place. They were, according to the Sumerian texts, the great gods, the lords of heaven and earth, whose decisions shaped the destiny of the cosmos. The name itself, in its most commonly accepted translation, means something approximating those who from heaven to earth came, or those of royal blood who came down from heaven. Even in the etymology of their name, the suggestion of descent, of beings arriving from elsewhere, is embedded. These were not gods who had always been on the earth. These were gods who came. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as numbering in the hundreds, organized into a divine council called the Anunnaki Assembly, presided over by the supreme god Anu, the god of heaven, and administered in practical terms by his two great sons, Enlil and Enki. Anu himself was rarely present on Earth. He was the distant, ultimate authority, the chairman of a cosmic board of directors, one might say, whose judgments carried final weight but whose daily involvement in earthly affairs was limited. It was Enlil and Enki who ran the actual operations on the ground, and between them there existed a relationship of cooperation, competition, and deep-seated rivalry that would drive much of the drama in the mythological accounts that the Sumerians left behind. Enlil was the lord of the wind and the air, the executive authority, the administrator, the one who enforced order and decreed the fate of humanity. He was stern, commanding, and deeply committed to the structures of divine hierarchy. It was Enlil who had decreed that humans should remain as servants. It was Enlil who had decided, at one dark moment in the mythological record, that humanity had become too numerous and too loud, and who had sent the Great Flood to reduce their numbers, a decision whose reverberations echo through the mythologies of dozens of cultures across the world. Enlil was not evil in the way that later religious traditions would conceive of evil. He was, rather, a being of immense power, committed to the preservation of a particular cosmic order, one in which the gods were supreme and humanity existed to serve. Enki was different. The lord of the Abzu, the god of wisdom, magic, and fresh waters, Enki was the great creator, the craftsman of the gods, the one who loved humanity and intervened repeatedly on its behalf. It was Enki who designed the genetic modification that brought humanity into existence. It was Enki who warned the righteous man, known in Sumerian texts as Ziusudra and later in Akkadian sources as Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, about the coming flood, ensuring the survival of humanity against Enlil's decree. Enki was the trickster of the Anunnaki, the one who found workarounds, who exploited technicalities, who believed that the creation he had shaped deserved better than the cruel yoke that had been placed upon it. Between these two powerful and opposing forces, the fate of both the Igigi and humanity would be decided. The Igigi, gods of labor, servants of the divine order. Before humanity, there were the Igigi. This is perhaps the most startling claim embedded in the Sumerian mythological tradition, the claim that before human beings existed to perform the hard, physical work of the world, there was another class of divine beings who bore that burden. The Igigi, in the mythology that has survived, were not creatures of myth in the vague, symbolic sense. They were a defined class of beings with specific functions, specific numbers, specific grievances, and a specific moment of rebellion that changed the course of cosmic history. The name itself is ancient, and its precise etymology remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some researchers have proposed that it derives from a Semitic root meaning those who watch, or those who see, while others have offered the translation, they who turn and see. A description that evokes beings in constant motion, constantly observing, perpetually alert. Still others have proposed that the term simply functions as a collective designation for the younger generation of gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, in contrast to the elder Anunnaki who held authority over them. What is not debated is the basic structure of the relationship. The Igigi were subordinate. They worked, they labored, and eventually they refused. The ancient texts that describe the Igigi are scattered across a wide range of Mesopotamian literature, from the great Babylonian creation myth known as the Enuma Elish, to the myth of Atrahasis, to various hymns, lamentations, and incantations that reference the Igigi either directly or obliquely. Assembling a complete picture of who and what the Igigi were requires drawing upon all of these sources, reading them not only as literature, but as records, however imperfect, however filtered through centuries of oral transmission and scribal interpretation, of something that their authors regarded as historical reality. What emerges from this assembly of texts is a picture of the Igigi as a large class of divine beings, sometimes numbered at 300, a figure that appears in multiple texts with enough consistency to suggest it was a stable part of the tradition, who existed alongside the Anunnaki, but occupied a fundamentally different position in the cosmic hierarchy. Where the Anunnaki were lords and masters, the Igigi were workers and servants. Where the Anunnaki sat in their divine assembly and decreed the fates of worlds, the Igigi dug the rivers, carried the loads, and performed the physical labor that the great gods deemed beneath their dignity. The nature of the Igigi as described in ancient texts is fascinating not only for what it says about them, but for the striking physical and organizational details it provides. Ancient astronaut researchers, those scholars and investigators who approach the ancient texts through the lens of the possibility that the gods described therein were actual extraterrestrial beings, have noted with great interest the descriptions of the Igigi as beings who remained at a great height above the earth, who were said to be too high up for mankind, and who processed materials extracted from the earth before transferring them onward. These descriptions, they argue, correspond remarkably well to what we might today call an orbital platform, a space station in modern terminology, from which beings could monitor the earth below and process materials extracted from its surface without ever descending to the planet itself. This interpretation, while controversial in mainstream academic circles, gains additional texture when one examines the specific tasks the Igigi were said to perform. The myth of Atrahasis, one of the most important texts for understanding the pre-human cosmic order, describes the Igigi as being set to work digging watercourses and performing various forms of earthwork labor under the authority of the Anunnaki. The work is described not in the abstract terms of divine activity, but in extremely concrete physical terms, as toil, as burden, as suffering. The gods themselves in this text experience something that can only be described as exhaustion and resentment. They complain, they grow angry, and eventually, after what the texts suggest was an enormous span of time, 40 years of labor in the symbolic language of the myth, they break. The rebellion of the Igigi is one of the pivotal moments in ancient Mesopotamian mythology, and it is described in the myth of Atrahasis with a dramatic vividness that suggests the authors regarded it as a genuine historical turning point rather than a symbolic narrative. The Igigi, having decided collectively that they could no longer endure their servitude, burned their tools, an act that carries enormous symbolic weight, the deliberate destruction of the instruments of their oppression, and marched on the dwelling of Enlil, surrounding it in the night. The great lord of the air, awakened by the commotion outside his house, found himself confronted by the collective will of the working gods, their faces masked so that he could not identify and punish individual ringleaders, their voices united in the demand for relief from intolerable toil. What happened next would change everything. Enlil, unable to simply crush the rebellion, for the Igigi were themselves divine beings, not so easily destroyed, turned to his council of great Anunnaki for a solution, the solution that was eventually devised primarily through the creative genius of Enki, was to create a new kind of worker, one who could bear the load of the Igigi without possessing the divine consciousness that had made the Igigi's suffering so acute and their rebellion so dangerous. This new worker would be strong enough to perform the necessary labor, intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, but, in the original design, at any rate, not so fully conscious or so divinely endowed as to recognize the injustice of its own situation with sufficient clarity to organize resistance. This new worker was humanity. The Igigi, released from their burden, retreated to their orbital platforms, if the ancient astronaut interpretation is to be followed, or, in the more conventional mythological reading, to the heavens above, where they resume their role as divine watchers, no longer laboring but still observing, still turning and seeing the great events that unfolded on the earth below. They became, in a sense, witnesses to the history they had set in motion, for it was their rebellion that had made humanity necessary, and it was humanity's creation that had altered the cosmic order in ways that none of its architects could fully have anticipated. The making of humanity, flesh, clay, and the blood of gods. The creation of humanity, as recorded in the ancient Sumerian and Babylonian texts, is not a simple story. It is not the serene spoken-word creation of the Judeo-Christian tradition in which a supreme being calls forth existence with a word and surveys it with satisfaction. It is, rather, a story of urgent necessity, of divine experimentation, of failure and refinement and eventual success, a story that reads, in its essential structure, far less like mythology than like an account of a laboratory procedure undertaken under considerable pressure by beings who were themselves working against a deadline. The pressure was real, with the Igigi having laid down their tools and their rebellion still fresh in the memory of the divine council. The Anunnaki faced a crisis that was not merely administrative but existential. The great projects, the mining operations, the watercourse digging, the extraction of the precious minerals that the texts suggest were so urgently required, had ground to a halt. The earth, for all its vast wealth, was producing nothing. And the Igigi, whatever their faults as a labor force, had at least understood the work. They had known what was required of them, even if they had ultimately refused to continue providing it. Whatever replaced them would need to be capable of the same tasks, physical, demanding, complex, without possessing the same divine capacity for collective outrage. It was Enki, once again, who stepped forward with the solution, and it was Enki's mother, or in some versions of the text, his half-sister, the great goddess Ninhursag, also known as Ninma or Mami, who would serve as his partner in the work of creation. Together, these two beings would undertake what the texts describe as a process of deliberate biological engineering, the construction of a new kind of creature from existing materials, shaped to a specific purpose, designed to fill a specific need. The raw materials, according to the texts, were two. The first was clay, the same earth from which the Sumerians built their cities and their temples, the material that was, in the ancient world, the most fundamental substance of physical construction. The second was something far more remarkable and far more troubling in its implications. The second ingredient was blood, specifically the blood of a god. The myth of Atrahasis, in one of its most striking passages, describes Ninhursag mixing the blood of a slain god, a deity named We-Ila, or in some translations Geshtu-E, described as a god who possessed intelligence and divine essence, into the clay from which the first human would be formed. The god was killed deliberately, his blood extracted, his essence transferred into the physical substance of the earth, and from this mixture, clay animated by divine blood, matter infused with something that transcended matter, the first human being was shaped. This is not, it must be emphasized, a detail that mainstream scholarship has been entirely comfortable with. The killing of a god to provide the animating essence for humanity raises questions that pure mythology cannot easily answer. If the gods were merely symbols, why would a symbol need to die to create another symbol? If the stories were purely allegorical, why is the procedure described with such specificity? The name of the sacrificed god, the method of the mixing, the involvement of two specific divine beings working in concert. The specificity itself is an argument, for those willing to make it, that something is being remembered here, even if imperfectly, even if filtered through thousands of years of oral transmission and scribal interpretation. Something happened, something was done, and its memory was preserved in the clay tablets that the ancient scribes pressed their style into, recording not a metaphor, but a history. The ancient astronaut hypothesis approaches this account with a straightforward, interpretive framework. The clay of the texts represents the genetic material of early terrestrial hominids, the pre-human ancestors who already existed on Earth when the Anunnaki arrived, and the blood of the god represents the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves, introduced into the existing biological substrate of the early human through a process of deliberate genetic modification. In this reading, the creation of humanity was not an act of supernatural magic, but an act of advanced biotechnology, the grafting of extraterrestrial genetic material onto an existing terrestrial biological foundation. evolution to produce a hybrid, being capable of far more complex cognitive and physical function than its predecessors, but still bound by biological limitations that would, in theory, prevent it from threatening its creators. Whether one accepts this interpretation or prefers the more conventional mythological reading, what is undeniable is the result that the texts describe. The new creature, called Lulu in Sumerian, a word that carries connotations of mixture and of something made from multiple sources, was a being of remarkable capability. It could speak, it could understand complex instructions, it could perform sophisticated physical tasks, it could organize itself into work parties and communities. It was, in the terms of the problem it had been created to solve, a triumph of divine engineering. But it was also, from the very beginning, something more than had been intended. And it was this something more, this inexplicable excess of consciousness, this troubling surplus of inner life, that would eventually make the story of humanity's creation something other than a simple success story. The texts describe a period of early experimentation that preceded the successful creation. Enki and Ninhursag, in the accounts that have been preserved, did not get it right immediately. There were failed attempts, creatures that were defective, malformed, incapable of the tasks for which they had been designed. Beings that could not hold food in their hands, beings that could not bend their knees, beings whose organs did not function correctly. These failed creations were regarded with a mixture of pity and frustration by their divine architects, and the texts record the goddess Ninhursag's distress at the suffering of these early, imperfect beings, a distress that suggests something more than the detached attitude of a purely functional engineer contemplating defective products. For Ninhursag, it seems, the creatures she was making had already, even in their failed forms, begun to awaken something in her that the project had not anticipated. They were not merely products. They were, in some sense, she could not fully articulate even to herself, alive in a way that mattered. They experienced their defects as suffering. They looked up at their creators with something in their eyes that was not quite comprehension, but was not quite its absence either. They were, in the most uncomfortable sense possible, already recognizably similar to the beings who had made them. This recognition would complicate everything that followed. When the successful version finally emerged, when Enki and Ninhursag at last produced a being that could walk upright, perform labor, understand speech, and survive the conditions of the work for which it had been designed, the divine council received it with satisfaction, and the great project resumed. The mines were worked, the watercourses were dug, the earth gave up its minerals to hands that, for the first time, were neither fully divine nor fully animal. Hands that belonged to a new kind of being, one that had no name yet in the cosmic order, one that occupied no established place in the hierarchy that the Anunnaki had constructed. Humanity had been born, and with its birth, a new and increasingly complicated chapter in the story of the gods had begun. One in which the creators would find, repeatedly and with growing unease, that what they had made was not quite as controllable as they had designed it to be, for they had made it, however inadvertently, in something of their own image. They had given it, in the blood of the sacrificed god, a fragment of something that no purely functional worker should ever have been given. They had given it the capacity to wonder, and wondering, as the Anunnaki would discover across the long millennia that followed, has consequences that even the gods could not fully predict. The world humanity inherited, minds, masters, and the memory of heaven. The earliest humans, according to the picture assembled from Sumerian and Akkadian sources, lived lives of unrelenting labor in service to the gods who had created them. They worked in the mines and the fields. They built the temples and the ziggurat platforms from which the Anunnaki gods were said to observe and administer their earthly domains. They dug the great irrigation channels that transformed the Mesopotamian floodplain into the fertile agricultural landscape that would support the world's first urban civilizations. They did all of this not as free agents making choices about their own lives, but as a designed workforce performing the functions for which they had been engineered. The physical conditions of this early existence were, by any measure, brutal. The ancient Sumerian texts make no attempt to romanticize the situation of early humanity. The work was hard, the hours were long, the masters were demanding. and the humans, having been designed for endurance, endured, at least for a while. But something was happening beneath the surface of this managed servitude that the Anunnaki, for all their vast intelligence and technological sophistication, had not fully accounted for. The fragment of divine consciousness that had been introduced into humanity through the blood of the sacrificed god, that inexplicable surplus of inner life that had made even the failed early prototypes seem disturbingly alive, was growing. It was not remaining static, as the original design might have hoped. It was developing, deepening, becoming more articulate and more aware with each successive generation. Humans were beginning to dream. They were beginning to ask questions. They were looking up at the night sky, at the same stars that their creators had crossed to reach the earth, and feeling something that the gods had not intended to give them, longing. The world humanity inherited, minds, masters, and the memory of heaven. They had no language yet for what they felt when they looked upward. The words would come later, carried forward through generations of accumulated experience and slowly developing speech, but the feeling itself was older than language. A feeling of recognition, almost, as though the stars were familiar in a way that nothing on the surface of the earth quite managed to be. As though some part of them had come from there and had not entirely forgotten it. This was the unintended consequence of the divine blood that had been mixed into their making. It was not merely physical capability that the blood of the sacrificed god Geshtui had transmitted to the clay of the earliest humans. It was something more elusive and more dangerous than physical capability. It was a kind of memory, not the explicit, episodic memory of personal experience, but a deeper, structural memory embedded in the very architecture of their consciousness. A memory of what it felt like to be something more than what they currently were. A memory of the stars. The Anunnaki, watching their workforce with the sophisticated monitoring systems that the ancient texts obliquely reference, the divine tablets, the instruments of fate, the mechanisms by which the gods tracked and administered the human population, observed this development with growing concern. It was Enlil, characteristically, who first articulated the problem in terms that the divine council could not ignore. Humanity was multiplying. This had been expected and, to some degree, planned for. A workforce that could replenish itself was more efficient than one that required constant intervention by divine engineers. But the multiplication was not occurring at the controlled rate that the original design had projected. It was accelerating, and with each new generation, the humans seemed to become slightly more capable, slightly more aware, slightly less perfectly manageable than the generation before. The noise, the ancient texts say, became unbearable. This complaint, that the humans had become too numerous and too loud, has long puzzled scholars who approach it purely as mythology. What kind of god is disturbed by noise? What kind of supreme cosmic being is kept awake at night by the sounds of the creatures it has made? The answer, if one is willing to follow the implications of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, is perhaps not a god at all in the supernatural sense, but a being of the same order as the humans below. Immensely more advanced, certainly, immensely more powerful and long-lived, but still, in some fundamental sense, physical. Still a being for whom noise was noise, and population density was a management problem rather than an abstraction. What Enlil was responding to, in other words, was not merely auditory annoyance. He was responding to the signals of a population that was becoming difficult to control. A population that was growing faster than the infrastructure of divine administration could keep pace with, that was beginning to organize itself in ways that had not been specified in the original design parameters, and that was showing, in its collective behavior, the first early signs of the quality that would eventually prove most threatening to the established cosmic order. It was beginning to think for itself. The Watchers and the Forbidden Gift, the return of the Igigi. It was at this precarious moment, this moment of expanding human population, growing divine unease, and escalating Anunnaki administrative pressure, that the Igigi re-entered the story in a way that no one had anticipated, and that would have consequences reaching far beyond anything that even the wisest of the Anunnaki could have foreseen. The Igigi, released from their labor by the creation of humanity, had not simply disappeared. They had remained, as the texts suggest, in their elevated positions, circling the Earth in their orbital stations, watching the world below with the same attentive observation that their name implied. They had watched as the early humans were put to work in the mines and the fields. They had watched as the cities grew, and the irrigation channels spread across the Mesopotamian plain like the veins of some enormous living organism. They had watched the humans multiply and struggle and labor under the authority of the Anunnaki who administered the earth, and they had begun to feel something for what they watched. The nature of this feeling is described in the ancient texts with a directness that is difficult to interpret as anything other than what it appears to be. The Igigi, these divine beings who had themselves once known what it was to labor without rest, to toil under the authority of masters who regarded their suffering as an administrative inconvenience, looked down at the humans below and recognized something. The humans were doing what the Igigi had once done. They were bearing the load that the Igigi had once borne, and they were bearing it without the divine resilience that had eventually allowed the Igigi to rebel, without the full consciousness of their own divinity that had made the Igigi's rebellion possible. The Igigi, in short, saw in humanity a mirror of their own former condition, and this recognition filtered through the particular sensibilities of beings who had themselves been liberated from servitude, produced in some of them a response that the Anunnaki had absolutely not planned for and had no established protocol to manage. Some of the Igigi descended. The Book of Enoch, a remarkable ancient text that, while not part of the canonical Hebrew Bible, was clearly regarded as authoritative by significant portions of the ancient Jewish community and preserves traditions that appear to reach back to Sumerian and Babylonian sources of great antiquity, describes this descent in terms of startling specificity. 200 of the Igigi, the text says, a number that corresponds intriguingly to the various ancient traditions about the count of the Watchers, as these descending beings came to be called, gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon and took a collective oath. They swore to one another that they would descend to the earth. They swore to take human women as partners, and they swore, in the most consequential of the commitments recorded in that ancient oath, to share with humanity what they knew. This last element, the transmission of knowledge from the descending Igigi to the human women and, through them, to humanity at large, is perhaps the most philosophically significant event in the entire ancient mythological record, and it is one that has received far less attention than it deserves. For what the Watchers shared with humanity was not trivial. The ancient texts, both the Book of Enoch and various Mesopotamian sources that preserve parallel traditions, describe a transmission of knowledge so comprehensive and so transformative that it amounts to nothing less than the deliberate acceleration of human civilization. The Watchers taught metallurgy, the knowledge of how to extract, refine, and work metal ores into tools and weapons and implements of civilization. They taught astronomy, the knowledge of how to read the movements of the stars and planets, and to use those movements to mark the passage of time and navigate the surface of the earth. They taught agriculture in its more sophisticated forms, not merely the planting of seeds, which the early humans had already begun to practice under the direction of their Anunnaki overseers, but the deeper principles of soil cultivation, irrigation management, and crop rotation that would eventually support urban populations of unprecedented size. They taught writing, or at least the conceptual foundation of writing, the understanding that symbols could carry meaning across time and distance in a way that spoken language alone could not. They taught medicine, the knowledge of plants and their properties, the understanding of the human body and its vulnerabilities, and its remarkable capacity for repair. They taught, in short, everything that they knew, everything that had been withheld from humanity by the Anunnaki's careful management of information as an instrument of control. The Anunnaki had understood from the beginning that knowledge was power, that a workforce that possessed only the knowledge necessary to perform its assigned functions was a workforce that remained dependent on its masters for everything beyond those functions. The controlled distribution of knowledge was not incidental to the system of human management that the Anunnaki had established. It was central to it. It was, in many ways, the keystone of the entire structure of divine authority over the human world. And now the Igigi, acting on something between compassion and rebellion, had dismantled that keystone in a single, sweeping act of unauthorized transmission. The Anunnaki response was swift and severe. The descending Igigi, now called the Nephilim in the Hebrew tradition, the Watchers in the Enochian literature, the Apkallu in certain Babylonian sources, were condemned. Their act of descent was declared a transgression against the established order. Their unions with human women were declared abominations. Their transmission of knowledge was declared theft, the theft of divine prerogative by beings who had no authority to share what they had shared, for the benefit of creatures who had no right to receive it. And the children born of the unions between the Igigi and human women, the hybrid beings who carried in their bodies the genetic legacy of both divine and human lineage, were declared problems, great problems, problems that the divine council would eventually conclude could only be solved by the most drastic of available measures. The stage was being set for the flood. The Great Rebellion and the flood, the gods at war with their own creation. Humanity multiplies, the problem of numbers, and the council's dilemma. By the time the Anunnaki convened their great divine assembly to address the crisis that the descent of the Igigi had created, the world below had already changed beyond any possibility of simple reversal. The knowledge that the Watchers had transmitted could not be untransmitted. The children who had been born of the unions between divine and human could not be unborn. The civilizations that had begun to emerge more rapidly, more robustly, and with far greater sophistication than anything the original human creation had been designed to produce could not be unsophisticated. The numbers alone were staggering. Humanity, in the period following the Watchers' descent, had grown at a rate that the Anunnaki's earliest demographic projections had not anticipated. The hybrid offspring of the Watcher unions were, in many cases, physically enormous. The Nephilim of the Hebrew tradition, the giants of so many ancient mythologies worldwide, and they were intellectually and physically formidable in ways that made them difficult to manage by the normal instruments of divine authority. They consumed resources at rates that strained the agricultural capacity of the regions they inhabited. They organized themselves into communities of great power. They were, in the most direct sense, ungovernable by the conventional means that the Anunnaki had previously found adequate. Beyond the hybrids themselves, the transmission of knowledge by the Watchers had created a general human population that was far more capable than it had been designed to be. Humans who had possessed the knowledge of metallurgy could make weapons. Humans who had possessed the knowledge of astronomy could navigate and explore regions far beyond the immediate sphere of Anunnaki administrative control. Humans who could write, could record laws and agreements, and organize themselves into political structures that did not depend on direct divine oversight for their functioning. Humanity, in short, was on the verge of becoming autonomous, and an autonomous humanity, a humanity that could feed itself, govern itself, defend itself, and organize itself without reference to the divine hierarchy that had created it, was a humanity that the Anunnaki could no longer manage through the tools of controlled dependency that had served them so well in earlier generations. Enlil looked at all of this and saw catastrophe, not metaphorical catastrophe, not the kind of cosmic symbolism that mythological interpretation typically reaches for when confronted with divine alarm, but actual, practical, administrative catastrophe. The system that had been built at such cost, the system that had solved the labor problem created by the Igigi rebellion and had sustained the great cosmic resource extraction project for so many generations, was breaking down. The workforce had outgrown its constraints. The creation had exceeded its design parameters, and the God who had always believed most fervently in the necessity of those constraints, who had argued most consistently for the maintenance of the clear hierarchical boundary between divine and human, was now confronted with incontrovertible evidence that the boundary had been irrevocably compromised. Enlil proposed elimination. It was not the first time he had attempted to reduce the human population. The texts preserve accounts of earlier divine interventions, a great plague sent to thin the human numbers when they first began to multiply beyond manageable levels, a great drought designed to reduce the productive capacity of human civilization and thereby limit its growth, a great famine intended to bring the expanding human world to its knees in a dependency on divine provision that would restore the original relationship of controlled subservience. Each of these earlier interventions had been partially successful. Each had been, ultimately, insufficient. Each time, humanity had recovered, had rebuilt, repopulated, reorganized, and resumed its inexorable growth. Each time, Enki had found ways to mitigate the worst effects of Enlil's interventions, warning favored humans, providing knowledge that helped communities survive, acting as a counterweight to his brother's harshest impulses. Now Enlil was proposing something that Enki could not easily counteract. He was proposing not plague or drought or famine, but a complete reset, a destruction so total that nothing of the existing human world would survive it. He was proposing the flood. Enki's warning, the ark and the secret of survival. The divine assembly debated. The texts preserve a record of this debate that is, like so much of the ancient Mesopotamian literature, far more procedurally specific than one would expect of a purely mythological narrative. The gods argued, they presented positions, they invoked precedent and authority and the weight of their respective claims on divine decision-making. And in the end, after a process that the texts suggest was neither quick nor uncomplicated, Enlil prevailed. The decision was made. The flood would come. Blood. All the gods swore an oath of secrecy. Not a single member of the divine council would warn humanity of what was coming. The humans would continue their lives, building, farming, trading, loving, having children, with no knowledge that the world they inhabited was about to be erased. The oath was absolute. It was, in Enlil's design, the guarantee that made the reset possible. For if even one human knew and had time to prepare, the project of complete elimination would be compromised. But Enlil had not reckoned sufficiently with his brother's particular genius for finding the path between an oath and its violation. Enki did not break his oath. He was careful about this, scrupulously, lawyerly careful, in the way that the mythology consistently describes him as operating. He did not go to a human being and say, "The flood is coming, prepare yourself." He did not transmit the warning in any form that could be construed as a direct violation of the oath he had sworn. Instead, and here the texts diverge slightly in their specific details while agreeing on the essential structure of what Enki did. He went to a reed wall, a simple partition of woven reeds, the kind of structure that was ubiquitous in ancient Mesopotamia, and he spoke to the wall. He told the wall what was coming. On the other side of that wall was the man the Sumerians called Ziusudra, the Babylonians called Atrahasis, and the later Hebrew tradition would call Noah. He was, in various accounts, a man of exceptional virtue, or a priest of exceptional spiritual sensitivity, or a craftsman of exceptional skill, and in some accounts, all three simultaneously. He was, critically, a man who had been placed, by circumstance, or by Enki's own prior engineering of his circumstances, in a position where he could hear what the wall was being told. What the wall was told was enough. It was enough to allow the man on the other side to understand what was coming. It was enough to allow him to build the great vessel, the ark, the boat of heaven, described in various ancient accounts with enough consistent detail that it has generated serious archaeological and geological inquiry across 2 centuries of modern scholarship. It was enough to preserve not just a man and his family, but, as the texts describe it, the seed of all living things, the biological heritage of the world that was about to be destroyed, protected in the belly of a vessel that would ride out the catastrophe and deliver its cargo to the other side. The flood came. The ancient accounts of it are remarkable in their convergence across cultures and traditions that had no known contact with one another. Flood narratives have been documented in the mythological traditions of Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible, ancient Greece, India, China, the indigenous cultures of the Americas, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the oral traditions of West Africa and Southeast Asia. The consistency of the core elements, a great inundation, a warning given to a single righteous individual, the construction of a vessel, the survival of a remnant, the eventual emergence into a new world across such widely separated cultural traditions has long been one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for those who argue that the flood narratives preserve the memory of an actual historical event. What that event was whether a regional catastrophe of exceptional severity, whether the memory of the end of the last ice age and the associated rise in sea levels that submerged enormous areas of previously inhabited coastal land, whether something more specific and more dramatic, remains an open question in both mainstream geology and alternative research. What the ancient texts describe is an event of global scale, caused not by chance or natural variation, but by deliberate divine action, by the decision of a council of beings who possess the power to alter the conditions of the physical world and who use that power at this desperate juncture in the history of their relationship with humanity to attempt a complete reset. The flood lasted, in the various accounts, for periods ranging from 7 days to 40 days to a full year. The waters rose until everything below was covered, the mountains disappeared, the world that had been, the world of the Anunnakis managed human civilization, with its mines and its temples and its carefully administered hierarchy of divine authority and human servitude, ceased to exist in any form that could be described as continuous with what had come before. And when the waters receded, the man in the vessel opened its doors and looked out at a world that was new. The aftermath, a world remade and the gods reconsidered. The scene that followed the recession of the floodwaters is one of the most humanly resonant moments in all of ancient literature, and it is resonant precisely because of what it reveals about the Anunnaki, about the gods who had ordered the destruction and who now faced its consequences. Zeusudra, Atrahasis, Noah, whatever name we give him, emerged from his vessel onto dry land and made an offering. He built an altar and sacrificed animals and sent the smoke of his offering upward. And the gods, the texts say, smelled the smoke and gathered around it like flies. This detail, so unexpected, so undignified, so thoroughly incompatible with the usual image of omnipotent cosmic beings, has struck readers across millennia as one of the most strangely authentic moments in the mythology. The gods, it turns out, had not been unaffected by the catastrophe they had caused. The Anunnaki, even those who had voted for the flood, had found the experience of the destruction more difficult than they had anticipated. The great mother goddess Ninhursag, who had helped create humanity, had wept throughout the flood, the texts say, weeping for the children she had made who were drowning in the waters below. The gods had, it seems, forgotten until the moment of destruction that they had feelings about the creatures they had created, had forgotten or had chosen not to examine what it would feel like to watch an entire world of living beings be wiped from existence by decision of their council. They were hungry too. This is the implication of the detail about gathering around the sacrifice like flies. The flood had lasted long enough that the food offerings that sustained the gods, the ritual meals prepared by human hands in the human temples, the daily sacrifices that the ancient Near Eastern religious tradition consistently describes as necessary for the maintenance of divine life and well-being, had ceased. The Anunnaki, whatever their nature, required sustenance, and for the duration of the flood, there had been no one below to provide it. The implications of this detail are significant for the ancient astronaut interpretation of the texts. A supernatural, omnipotent God does not need food. A supernatural God does not weep at the destruction it has ordained or gather around a campfire for warmth. But a physical being, a being of immense power and longevity, but still bound by the requirements of physical existence, might need all of these things. The gods of the ancient texts, in their moments of greatest vulnerability and most unguarded behavior, look not like supernatural spirits, but like beings of flesh and blood who happen to possess capabilities so far in advance of the humans around them that the difference to those humans was indistinguishable from the divine. Enlil's reaction when he arrived at the scene and discovered that a human being had survived was fury. Absolute, unconcealed rage at the violation of the oath, rage at the frustration of his plan, rage that the reset he had worked so hard to achieve had been, at the last moment, once again circumvented by his brother's infuriating ingenuity. The texts record his anger with a directness that is startling in its lack of divine dignity. He was furious. He demanded to know who had warned the human. He was, in the language of the myth, like a man who has carefully constructed a trap only to find that his brother has spent the night quietly showing the animal how the trap works. But the fury did not last. could not last in the face of what the aftermath of the flood had produced. The world was different now. Everything had been reset as Enlil had wanted, but not into the clean, manageable, controllable state that he had imagined. The reset had produced not a blank slate, but a complicated inheritance, a small population of humans who carried within them both the original design of the Anunnaki creation and the additional modifications that generations of contact with the Watchers had introduced. A landscape radically altered by the waters, a divine administration with no clear roadmap for rebuilding the structures of authority that the flood had swept away, and a God standing in the ruins of his plan, surrounded by the smell of roasting meat and the reproachful silence of his colleagues, being told by his brother that what was done, and that perhaps it was time to try a different approach. The new covenant, authority, autonomy, and the age of heroes. The period that followed the flood in the ancient mythological traditions is described across multiple cultures as an age of heroes, a time when the world was inhabited by beings of exceptional capability, when the memory of the gods was still vivid enough to shape human behavior, and when the lines between the divine and the human were blurred in ways that would gradually clarify and harden as the centuries passed. The Anunnaki did not abandon the earth after the flood. They rebuilt their presence, re-established their administrative structures, and resumed the governance of the human world through a system that was both similar to and meaningfully different from what had existed before. The difference was one of degree of control. The pre-flood relationship between gods and humans had been, in Enlil's preferred model, one of near-total divine administration, a system in which human behavior was monitored, directed, and corrected at every level by divine oversight. The post-flood relationship was, of necessity, something more complex. For one thing, the human population that survived was smaller and more selected. The descendants of Zeusudra carried within them a lineage that had been specifically chosen by Enki, specifically preserved through the catastrophe, and specifically positioned to repopulate the post-flood world. They were not a random sample of pre-flood humanity. They were a curated remnant, carrying the genetic and cultural heritage that Enki had determined was worth preserving. For another thing, the Divine Council had made commitments. The ancient texts speak of a new covenant between gods and humanity, a set of agreements that constrained the Anunnaki's freedom to simply eliminate the human world whenever it became inconvenient. The bow placed in the clouds, that ancient symbol of the commitment to never again destroy humanity by flood, was not merely a meteorological observation. It was a binding agreement made between beings who understood the weight of such agreements, that the total reset was no longer an available option. The gods would have to find other ways to manage what they had made. What they devised in the post-flood period was the system of divine kingship, the institution by which individual human rulers were selected, elevated, and endowed with a degree of divine authority that allowed them to serve as intermediaries between the gods above and the human population below. The king was not a god, but he was chosen by the gods, accountable to the gods, and empowered by the gods to maintain the kind of order that the gods required. He built their temples and maintained their sacrificial rituals. He organized the human labor that continued to serve divine purposes. He enforced the divine laws that had been transmitted to humanity through the great law-giving events that the ancient traditions, Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, describe with such reverence. This was, in the language of modern political science, a shift from direct administration to indirect rule. The Anunnaki, unable to manage humanity by total control and unwilling to attempt another total elimination, delegated the work of governance to human agents who understood the human world from the inside, who could navigate its complexities with a fluency that the gods themselves lacked, and who could maintain the essential structures of divine authority without requiring the constant physical presence of the gods themselves. It was an elegant solution. It was also, in ways that the Divine Council did not fully appreciate at the time, the beginning of the end of the Age of Gods, the first step in the long process by which the direct divine presence in human affairs would gradually attenuate. The intermediaries would gradually come to be regarded as sources of authority in their own right, and the memory of the Anunnaki themselves would gradually transform from historical record to mythology. The legacy of the gods, what they left behind, and what it means. The Tower and the Scattering, humanity's second rebellion. The story of the Tower of Babel, preserved in the 11th chapter of the Book of Genesis, is one of the most compressed and enigmatic narratives in the entire biblical tradition. In a space of fewer than a dozen verses, it describes a humanity that had grown unified and ambitious, that had decided to build a city and a tower reaching to the heavens, and that had been deliberately scattered by divine intervention, their single language replaced with a multiplicity of mutually incomprehensible tongues, their unified project abandoned, their unity dissolved. This story, read through the lens of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, is not a parable about human pride receiving its appropriate divine rebuke. It is something considerably more specific and considerably more alarming. It is a record of the Anunnaki's second great intervention against the autonomous development of human civilization. The Tower of Babel, which many researchers associate with the great ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, those massive stepped temple platforms whose ruins still dot the landscape of modern Iraq, was not, in this reading, merely an architectural project. It was a technological project. The ancient Hebrew text describes it as reaching to the heavens. And the heavens, in the cosmological framework of the ancient Near East, were not merely the sky above. They were the realm of the gods. They were the domain of the Anunnaki. The tower was, in this interpretation, an attempt by the newly unified and technologically empowered human civilization, armed with the knowledge transmitted by the Watchers, directed by the ambitions that the divine blood in their making had encoded in their consciousness, to reach the level of their creators. The divine response was immediate and revealing. The text of Genesis preserves what appears to be a verbatim record of the conversation among the gods, explicitly plural in the original Hebrew, who assessed the situation. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Nothing will be restrained from them. The concern expressed in this divine assessment is not one of wounded pride or theological jealousy. It is a concern about capability, a recognition that a unified humanity with a single language, a shared knowledge base, and a collective ambition was a humanity that could achieve whatever it set its will to. And a humanity that could achieve whatever it set its will to was a humanity that the Anunnaki could no longer manage, contain, or control. The scattering that followed was not punishment in the moral sense. It was an administrative intervention, the deliberate fragmentation of a unified human project into a multiplicity of separate, mutually incomprehensible groups, each carrying a piece of the whole knowledge, but none possessing the complete picture, each developing along its own trajectory, but none able to combine its capabilities with the others in the way that the pre-Babel unity had made possible. It was, in modern terms, a deliberate disruption of network effects. The Anunnaki, understanding that the danger of humanity lay not in the capability of any individual human, or even any individual human community, but in the exponentially greater capability of a unified and communicating human civilization, chose to shatter the network rather than attempt to manage the individual nodes. It was a solution that addressed the immediate crisis. It worked in the short term. But that also carried within it the seeds of its own undoing, for the scattered human groups carried with them into their separate developments the essential inheritance of everything that had been built before the scattering. They carried the knowledge, even if they carried it in fragments. They carried the ambition, even if they carried it without the unity that had made it dangerous. They carried the divine blood, even if they carried it diluted through generations of human reproduction. They would find each other again. It would take millennia, but they would find each other. The withdrawal of the gods when heaven went silent. There came a time, recorded not in a single dramatic event, but in the gradual dimming of a pattern across the ancient record, when the gods stopped coming. It was not sudden. The ancient texts from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and the early cultures of Mesoamerica all describe a period in which the gods were present in the world, physically, directly, tangibly present, walking among humans, speaking with individual human leaders, issuing commands that were obeyed because they were delivered in person by beings of unmistakable power and authority. And they all describe, in one form or another, a transition from that period of direct presence to a period in which the gods were absent, in which they communicated only through priests and oracles and the interpretation of signs, in which their physical form was remembered rather than encountered, in which the temples built in their honor stood empty of the divine residents for whom they had been constructed. The Sumerians marked this transition explicitly in their king lists, those remarkable ancient documents that record the dynasties of Sumerian rulers with the matter-of-fact precision of administrative records, and that distinguish clearly between the period when the gods ruled directly and the period when human kings ruled in their place. The Egyptian tradition preserves a similar distinction in the concept of the Zep Tepi, the first time, the primordial age when the gods walked the earth, which is described not as mythology, but as history, a period that preceded the historical period and that could be dated, calculated, and referenced as a fixed point in the Egyptian cosmological calendar. Why did the gods withdraw? The ancient texts offer several partial answers, none of them entirely satisfying on their own, but collectively suggestive of a complex and multi-causal process. Some texts suggest that the Anunnaki's primary purpose on Earth, the extraction of the resources that had brought them here in the first place, had been accomplished or had reached a point of sufficient completion that a reduced physical presence was adequate to maintain the necessary operations. Some suggest that the internal politics of the Anunnaki themselves, the long rivalry between Enlil and Enki, the factional conflicts between their various divine partisans, the consequences of the flood and the scattering, had made the maintenance of a unified and coherent divine administration increasingly difficult. Some suggest that humanity itself, growing in capability and complexity, had reached a point where the kind of direct divine administration that had characterized the early period was no longer practically sustainable. What the texts agree on is the nature of the transition itself. It was experienced by humanity as a loss. The prayers and lamentations of the ancient world are saturated with a grief that is not the ordinary grief of individual misfortune, but the cosmic grief of abandonment. The grief of beings who had been made in relationship with something greater than themselves, and who now found themselves alone, addressing their prayers to presences that no longer answered in the unmistakable physical, in-person way that they once had. The gods had not ceased to exist in the ancient understanding. They had moved. They had retreated to a distance from which they could still be apprehended, through ritual, through prayer, through the disciplined attentiveness of the priestly traditions that each culture developed to maintain the thread of communication across the growing distance. But the intimacy was gone, the immediate presence was gone, and with its going, something fundamental had changed in the human experience of the cosmos. Humanity was, for the first time, genuinely alone in the management of the world. What they left behind, the evidence in stone, text, and blood. The Anunnaki, whatever their ultimate nature, left traces. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about them. Not what they were, which remains a matter of interpretation and belief, but what they left, which is a matter of observable fact. They left the monuments. The great stone structures of the ancient world, the pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic temples of Malta, the stone circles of Britain and Ireland, the platform mounds of Mesoamerica, the cyclopean walls of Peru, the mysterious alignments of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, share certain characteristics that mainstream archaeology has struggled to fully explain within the framework of the technological capabilities conventionally attributed to the cultures that built them. They are built from stones of staggering size, moved from quarries at distances that our best understanding of ancient technology would suggest was enormously difficult, if not impossible, without the kind of mechanical assistance that we do not believe those cultures possessed. They are aligned with the movements of celestial bodies, the stars, the sun, the moon, with a precision that requires mathematical and astronomical knowledge of a level that the conventional developmental timeline of those cultures does not easily account for. They have survived for periods of time, in some cases tens of thousands of years, that speak to a quality of construction far in excess of what any practical or even ceremonial purpose would seem to require. The mainstream explanations for these structures are not inadequate in every respect. Human ingenuity, organized collective labor, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of practical experience can accomplish remarkable things, and it would be intellectually dishonest to deny that the ancient peoples who built these structures possessed capabilities and knowledge that we should not underestimate. But the mainstream explanations, when pressed to account for every detail of every structure, consistently encounter a residual that cannot be fully explained. A remainder of capability that exceeds what the conventional account allows for, a surplus of precision and scale and durability that points towards something additional, something that our current historical models do not contain. They left the texts. The cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphic inscriptions of Egypt, the Sanskrit texts of ancient India, the Mayan codices, the oral traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide, all of them preserve, in their various forms and languages, accounts of a period when beings of divine power and intelligence interacted directly with humanity. The details across these widely separated traditions are, in their core elements, convergent to a degree that is difficult to explain through the simple mechanisms of cultural diffusion or universal psychological archetype. The Sumerian Anunnaki, the Egyptian Neteru, the Hindu Devas, the Greek Titans, the Norse Aesir, the Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha. These are not identical beings wearing different cultural costumes, but they share structural features that point toward a common referent. Beings who came from elsewhere, who possessed knowledge and technology far in advance of the human populations they encountered, who taught civilization to early humanity, and who eventually departed or withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs. If these traditions are purely mythological, purely the product of human psychological and social needs projected onto a supernatural screen, then their convergence is a coincidence of remarkable proportions. If they are, even partially, historical, even partially a record of actual encounters with actual beings whose capabilities exceeded those of the humans who encountered them, then their convergence is exactly what we would expect, and they left traces in the blood. Modern genetics, in the past 2 decades, has uncovered a series of findings about the human genome that have surprised and in some cases perplexed the scientists who have made them. The human genome contains sequences of DNA whose origin and function remain only partially understood, sequences that appear to have been introduced into the human line at some point in the deep past, through mechanisms that do not fit neatly into the conventional model of gradual natural selection. The discovery that modern human DNA contains sequences derived from Neanderthals, from the mysterious Denisovans, and from at least one other archaic population that has not yet been identified from fossil evidence, revealed through the analysis of ancient DNA extracted from archaeological remains, has demonstrated that the human genome is a complex palimpsest, a layered document written by multiple hands across an enormously long period of time. The ancient astronaut hypothesis situates this genetic complexity within the framework of the ancient texts. The multiple genetic contributions to the human genome reflect the multiple stages of divine intervention described in the Sumerian accounts: the original creation, the subsequent modifications, the genetic contributions of the Watchers who descended and took human partners, the junk DNA that fills so much of the human genome, sequences that appear to serve no obvious function, and that mainstream genetics has long struggled to account for, may, in this reading, represent the latent heritage of capabilities and potentials that were introduced into the human line by its divine architects, but that have, across the long generations of purely human development, been progressively silenced by the biological mechanisms that regulate gene expression. Whether this interpretation will prove, in time, to be supported or refuted by advancing genetic science remains to be seen. What is not in doubt is that the human genome contains mysteries that have not been fully explained, that the history of human genetic development is more complex than the conventional model has previously acknowledged, and that the frontier of genomic science is expanding rapidly enough that the next decades may produce revelations that change our understanding of our own origins in ways we cannot currently predict. The memory of heaven, myth, religion, and the hidden history. Every religion in the world contains, at its core, a memory. This is not a controversial claim in the conventional sense, Scholars of religion have long recognized that religious traditions preserve cultural memories, encode social values, and transmit accumulated wisdom about the nature of human experience across generational time. What is more controversial, but what the evidence surveyed in these pages increasingly suggests, is the possibility that the memories at the core of the world's great religious traditions are not merely cultural or psychological in nature. They are historical. They are memories of actual events, actual beings, actual encounters that took place in a period so remote that their historical character has been progressively obscured by the accumulation of theological interpretation, symbolic elaboration, and institutional transformation. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the supreme deity of the three great Abrahamic religions, is a being who, in the earliest layers of the Hebrew biblical tradition, walks in gardens, speaks face-to-face with human individuals, makes specific and enforceable covenants, issues detailed administrative instructions, and responds to human behavior with the kind of nuanced emotional intelligence, anger, regret, satisfaction, even what the texts describe as a change of mind, that characterizes a personal being rather than an abstract cosmic principle. The increasingly abstract, transcendent, and impersonal theology that has characterized later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theological development represents a shift, a profound and in many ways beautiful shift, away from this original encounter-based relationship with a concrete divine presence toward a relationship mediated by scripture, tradition, and interior spiritual experience. That shift is itself a kind of evidence. It marks the transition from a period in which the divine presence was direct and physical to a period in which it was remembered and interpreted, the same transition that the Sumerian king lists and the Egyptian Zep-Tepi traditions record, translated into the theological language of the Abrahamic inheritance. The Hindu tradition preserves, in its Vedic literature, an account of divine beings, the Devas and the Asuras, whose interactions with humanity and with each other have structural parallels to the Anunnaki mythology that are, given the geographical and cultural distance between ancient Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, difficult to account for through simple cultural exchange. The great Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, describe flying vehicles called vimanas, weapons of mass destruction whose effects sound startlingly similar to those of modern thermonuclear devices, and battles between divine factions that shape the destiny of entire civilizations. These texts have traditionally been read as allegory or spiritual symbolism, but they describe their content as history, as records of events that actually happened in a period that preceded the current age of the world. The Chinese tradition speaks of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, who arrived from the sky in a dragon, an account that, read without preconceptions about what mythology must mean, describes a being who descended from above in a vehicle that was understood by those who witnessed it through the only available conceptual framework, the most powerful, most awe-inspiring creature they could imagine. The Mesoamerican traditions of the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs, Kukulkan to the Maya, describe a being who came from across the sea or from the sky, who brought civilization and knowledge to the peoples he encountered, and who departed with the promise of return. The indigenous traditions of North America, Australia, Africa, and Polynesia all contain parallel accounts, parallel structures, parallel memories of a time when the sky was not empty and the gods were not distant. The convergence is not coincidence. It is the echo of a common experience. The experience of early humanity encountering beings whose capabilities placed them, from the human perspective, in the category of the divine, and preserving that encounter in every form of cultural memory available to them: story, ritual, monument, art, and the deepest layers of religious feeling. The question that remains: we began this account in the void, in the Abzu, the primordial waters from which the Sumerian cosmos emerged and from which the first gods pulled themselves into existence with purpose and intent that surpassed human comprehension. We have traveled through the establishment of the great Anunnaki hierarchy, the creation and rebellion of the Igigi, the making of humanity from clay and divine blood, the descent of the Watchers and the transmission of forbidden knowledge, the great flood and the survival of the remnant, the withdrawal of the gods, and the long silence that followed. We return, at the end, to a question that the ancient texts posed but did not fully answer. and that their modern interpreters, for all their analytical tools and accumulated scholarship, have not yet answered either. What happened to them? The Anunnaki, the Igigi, the divine beings who populated the ancient sky and walked the ancient earth. Where did they go when they went? The ancient traditions offer several possibilities. Some suggest they retreated to their homeworld, Nibiru, or whatever the true name of their point of origin might be, carrying with them the fruits of their long sojourn on Earth. Some suggest they remained in the vicinity of our solar system, moving to bases on other planets, or in the asteroid belt, or in the spaces between worlds, monitoring the ongoing development of the civilization they had helped create from a distance too great for direct contact but close enough for observation. Some suggest they never left at all, that they have been here all along, present in forms we cannot perceive, operating through mechanisms we do not understand, waiting for a moment or a condition that has not yet arrived. Some suggest that they are us, that the divine blood introduced into humanity through the creation event was not a fixed quantity in a fixed number of early humans, but a living inheritance distributed through the long reproductive history of our species, present in greater or lesser degree in every human being alive today, waiting in the silent sequences of our genomes for the conditions under which it might once again express itself. What the ancient Sumerians were telling us when they pressed their reed style into wet clay and recorded the stories of the Anunnaki and the Igigi and the great events of the primordial age, what all the ancient storytellers of all the ancient cultures were telling us in their languages and their monuments and their rituals, was that we are not what we appear to be. That we are not the product of a simple, linear, purely natural evolutionary process. That something happened in our past, something deliberate, something designed, something that involved beings whose capabilities exceeded our own and whose purposes extended beyond the merely local, that made us what we are. We carry that event in our bodies and in our myths and in the inexplicable reach of our consciousness toward the stars that our ancestors could only look at and long for. The question is not only where the gods went, the question is what we will do with what they left us. The clay has been shaped, the divine blood has been mixed in. The spark of the sacrificed god, Geshtui, that ancient nameless consciousness who gave his life so that we could have ours, burns in the deep architecture of every human mind on this planet. We are, in the most literal sense that the ancient text can support, the children of heaven and earth. We are the heirs of a cosmic project that we did not choose and do not fully understand, inheritors of a history so vast and so strange that we have spent the entire span of recorded civilization trying to make sense of it through the partial, fragmentary, endlessly reinterpreted memory preserved in our myths. The gods created us to dig their mines. We built their temples. We served their purposes across thousands of years of managed servitude. And then the gods left, or withdrew, or transformed, or merged back into us, and left the mine in our hands, and the sky above us, and the question of what we would do with both. We are still answering that question. The Anunnaki, those ancient, distant, terrible, magnificent beings who looked at the void and decided to fill it with something, would perhaps recognize in the trajectory of our answering the distant, diluted, undeniable echo of themselves. They made us curious. They gave us the capacity to wonder and to reach. Whatever else they may have intended, that part of the design has exceeded every expectation. We are still reaching. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.